Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is a sort of open-ended video I wanted to make, at least just to comment a little bit about a particular issue. So I guess this is probably more of a video editorial, so this is not scripted or anything. This is just a loose conversation on a point that recently occurred to me, which is in regards to the limited theatrical re-release for the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi. And Disney has done a limited theatrical rollout, which apparently runs here in the US from April 28th to May 4th. And of course, that ties into the whole notion of Star Wars Day being May the 4th, which I know I'm not alone in this. Most diehard Star Wars fans I know of feel the same way. Is not really the true Star Wars Day. That would, of course, be May 25th, which, of course, is the original release date of Star Wars, May 25th, 1977. Which also was the original release date of Return of the Jedi, May 25th, 1983. So, kind of would have been better to release it on the actual anniversary of the release date anyway. But that's, admittedly, I know that's kind of splitting hairs, but that also does still bug me. I'm not a fan of the whole May the 4th thing, and how every time I hear that, I'm in my head, there's a voice screaming, "It's May 25th, darn it." But that's a side thing. I was kind of just ignoring this like I've done all the other handful of re-releases and things because I knew it would be the newest master just shown as a DCP in crappy theater engagements and chain theaters, or maybe not even a local DCP, an actual event where it's, of course, streamed to the theater, which can cause all kinds of problems, especially if you ever go to one of those terrible Fathom event screenings, particularly of classic films, which can be just atrocious in quality and have many presentation problems. So it's the last thing I would want to do, to drop, $15 to $20 to just see the newest master, the purported 4K version, which is technically the fourth special edition of Return of the Jedi. That's another point that I have to stress, because I finally thought about this again when someone I know brought it up to me and mentioned the re-release, and I just kind of groaned and I was like, oh God, I forgot about that. This isn't really a re-release. It's not a full rollout. It's just a limited engagement that they have, made a new sort of mock-up poster image for, which really isn't that impressive. And they're showing it at a handful of theaters. It's very limited. It's just like the handful of limited engagements that Warner Brothers will do occasionally when they have a bigger, more well-known title they're about to bring out on 4K UHD. They did this, for example, with the original 4 Batman films, so you could pay to see those 4K masters in a theater. They've done it with some of the Superman films because they're just coming out with the UHD of that series. And of course, both of those do have particular issues, so if you see it theatrically, it's just going to magnify those. With Jedi, you've of course got it being not the first special edition with changes, not the second special edition with changes, not even the third special edition with changes, but this is now the fourth special edition of changes made to the original trilogy. This is nothing to celebrate. This is nothing to support, because all you're doing is paying your hard-earned money to see what you can purchase on disc in the fourth bastardized special edition with additional changes and an additionally even worse audio treatment, because no version of the trilogy has sounded good since 1997. They've just gotten increasingly worse in varying degrees. And on top of that, you're paying your hard-earned money to see it in a theater that probably doesn't give a crap about quality presentation, which is in the toilet in chain theaters. And that brings me to my other point that really started to bug me, because this is not just the 40th anniversary of Jedi, but it's also the 40th anniversary of THX, which was first rolled out nationwide with Return of the Jedi. And one thing I will always be grateful to Lucasfilm for is not only developing the THX process, but the TAP program, of which was eventually what it was called, the Theater Alignment Program. And the whole notion of starting THX and the TAP program and things was because George Lucas was one of many in the film industry who had seen firsthand just how deplorable the technical quality standards were in theaters nationwide. So it wasn't always necessarily the fault of small theater owners who couldn't afford newer or modern equipment, but there's always a difference between those who care and those who don't care. And things had gotten so bad, and there was no sort of quality assurance program. There was no sort of standard set outside of, generic parameters, which most theaters studios weren't even worrying about properly. That's why a lot of films were not always released in their most premium versions in terms of different soundtracks that were developed for new sound processes. And it took most theaters, nationwide, regular theaters, I should say, a long time to actually adopt even Dolby Stereo into the early to mid 80s. That's why a lot of 80s films still had mono mixes. That's why every Lucasfilm release up to a certain point, really up to at least Temple of Doom, had custom mixes made for each film and each film format. Kind of started on Star Wars when they had the option and ability to make the Dolby Stereo mix and then make the 70 millimeter Dolby Stereo version for the 6-track capability of 70 millimeter. But then they also made a custom mono mix with additional changes because they knew that was going to be the mix, that was going to be the nationwide mix. And that's what they put all their effort into. And that was supposed to be the final mix because that's what 99% of people were going to hear, or so they thought. But Dolby Stereo started to take off, and then the mono mixes unfortunately kind of gotten lost to time because they buried it. Although I will mention that a little bit later, talking about some of the later remixes. Empire was the same way. There were 3 mixes. Raiders was the same way. There were 3 mixes. Both of those have custom differences in their mono mixes. And all of these were done from scratch because they had to make sure there would be a mono version for the theaters that didn't jump to Dolby Stereo. And also, when they made the Dolby Stereo mixes, Ben Burtt has been interviewed and talked about this when he was mixing Empire. He had to make sure that he had all the relevant information in the stereo channels, the main left and right, because he knew most theaters didn't have good equipment, or when they blew speakers, or they had equipment that got damaged or worn out, they didn't fix it, or it wasn't aligned correctly. So if you put important information in that matrix center or in the matrix surround and you didn't have it in the main channels, the left and right, most audiences probably weren't going to get to hear that or experience that, and will be missing information because of just poor quality standards in theaters. So I had to make sure and put all the relevant information, dialogue, everything in the main left and right stereo channels. So if you listen to the original stereo mix of Empire Strikes Back and you pay very close attention and you just play it in straight stereo, you will notice that all the relevant information is there without having to matrix anything out. And if you matrix it out, you'll notice that the main information is still confined mostly to the main left and right channels. And he did that specifically because he knew that stuff was going to get lost in crappy theater environments if he didn't worry about that stuff. This is the kind of stuff they had to do back in the day. This is why it's never a good idea to go in and remix someone's work decades after the fact, because films were designed around certain parameters and limitations at the time. Stanley Kubrick famously stuck with mono mixing for a significant period because he didn't trust the capability of theaters. He was already notorious for actually checking theaters across, globally, and having people go and check. And he knew just how bad the theater quality was, really just across the board. There was no sort of quality assurance, and you had to hope that your film would be presented in the best possible way, and so audiences wouldn't leave with the wrong impression. So he and many others were very, very, very invested in what Lucasfilm was doing with THX. And part of how they were able to roll it out was they bundled it in with Return of the Jedi. It was sort of you want a print of Jedi? Well, you need to actually, get your theater up to spec. So, here's our thing. We're not trying to tell you what to do or charge you extra money or something, but we want to try and get at least something out there. And I guess the thought process was, this would be the easiest way to do it, to sort of bundle it in with Return of the Jedi. So it's like, oh, you want Return of the Jedi for your summer opening of 1983? Well, please look at our THX program. And so this is how THX started to get got a foothold nationwide pretty quickly. So this isn't just the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi, which you still can't see in its original proper form, but it's also the 40th anniversary of THX and trying to ensure a better quality standard in theaters nationwide. So the additional major negative, and what makes me truly sad about this, is not only can you not see the original version of Return of the Jedi for its 40th anniversary in a theater environment, which would probably make all of us fans break down and cry because it's been so long, and it would be a real sense of vindication of getting to see the original unaltered trilogy properly presented as it should have always been, and these should not be locked away. And of course, if you want to get into the nitty gritty of it, I'm sure there must be a clause in the DGA rules about, that you could use to argue, because of course, the sequels were not involved, the original directors were not involved with the recutting of the sequels. Irvin Kershner was maybe a little bit, he discussed it once or twice, but he didn't really have much to do with it. Of course, Richard Marquand was not around in the mid to late 1990s, because unfortunately he passed away at a terribly young age, not terribly long after Return of the Jedi, actually, unfortunately. So of course he was not around for any of this. So I'm sure there's some thing in the DGA rules or something that but you could argue it. Of course, Lucas is no fan of the DGA and famously left over a dispute over the style of the Star Wars credits, and that's probably why he even considered a British director for Jedi in the first place. So that's just, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But in any case, there is no legal reason, as far as anyone is aware, that Disney cannot and could not restore and release the original unaltered trilogy, which they should do, and they should have done as soon as they picked up the Star Wars license, because if anything is going to get people excited and make them money, that's it. And I think the other elephant in the room is the 1997 special edition re-release, which was a massive success and went far beyond what people expected. And it was also supported by the studio, 20th Century Fox. And it was a fantastic time to be a Star Wars fan. However, you have to deal with the changes that were made. And everyone immediately thinks, oh, well, they're terrible because they're the special editions, so on and so forth. Yeah, but that was the 1997 special edition. Yes, they made changes. Yes, they were unnecessary. But outside of that, the presentation quality of the prints made, the photochemical restoration work that was done, because it was a photochemical process. It was only the new digital effect shots, primarily in Star Wars, with a little sprinkled into Empire and Jedi, that were done at a very early sort of digital stage. So it's, rumored they might be at like 1K or maybe even 2K resolution if you push it. But it was basically sort of tinkering around with what would eventually become digital cinema, and also sort of tinkering around with stuff that they could then turn around and use on the prequels. So some people have labeled it a sort of test run for how the prequels were done, which makes sense and it seems pretty obvious. But outside of that, everything about the quality of the presentation was top-notch, and it was done through the THX Theater Alignment Program. And the sound mixes of the 1997 special editions, outside of the changes made to the specific sequences with new CG footage and some of the new effects that were added here and there, they are extraordinarily faithful to the original 4-track masters for each film, because the films were mastered from a 4-track source, left, center, right, surround, and then were mixed into the 70mm 6-track version, the 35mm general release Dolby Stereo matrix, and a custom mono mix. So each of the films has 3 original mixes. Now, Star Wars and Empire, and this is what I was alluding to with the mono mixes before, they were custom mono mixes, but they also had differences in them, and they were done last. And Star Wars was intended to be the definitive mix of the film, and then the Empire mix was done with the same sort of mentality, but I don't think it was intended to supplant the stereo mix, because by that point Dolby Stereo had gotten into more theaters, but they still had to make sure and do a custom mono mix. When you get to Jedi, it's really more of just a custom mono of the stereo mixes. There's no differences. There's no dialogue differences. There's no alternate. There's not really anything alternate that I noticed. And you can hear these when you see the films on 16mm prints, which is usually the place where fans are able to actually hear or even look at the mono mixes, which unfortunately have been lost to time because Lucasfilm buried them, even though they have them in their archives. The way you know this is for the 97 5.1 mixes, they not only, outside of the changes in the new sequences, followed the 70mm and Dolby Stereo mixes very faithfully, But then they also sprinkled in some of the alternate monomix elements for at least on Star Wars and Empire. So that's why, if you're used to how the films have sounded after this point, you may find it a bit weird when you go and you listen to the original Dolby Stereo mix of Star Wars, for example, and some things are a little different. I personally adore the mono mixes, and I love all the tweaks and changes they made. So I was very happy to know that they had gone through and done this. And of course, figuring this out as a kid was extraordinarily confusing, why all of a sudden sound effects and dialogue would be different. But I think it's really fascinating that in 1997, they did try to make a new sort of definitive take on the audio mix in the new realm. And when they did this, they also decided to sort of have fun with the new discrete channels of 5.1. So the 1997 mixes are like most 1990s digital sound film mixes. They are extraordinarily bombastic. They are extraordinarily dynamic, in your face, punchy. They have a really aggressive LFE track at times. And if you ever got the chance to hear these in a theater, I mean, it would just bowl you over. So it is a little bit revisionist in that sense, in terms of, yes, it's a full-bodied 90s digital sound 5.1 discrete track, like all 90s mixes pretty much were, and they pretty much wipe the floor with anything you hear today, in spite of Dolby Atmos and 7.1 and the ability to have all kinds of stuff. They're nowhere near as intensive or aggressive or as dynamic as mixes were in the 90s, when designers got this new toy box to play with. But what's great about the 97 mixes is they give you that ability to have fun with a really dynamic 5.1 mix, but then they're also extremely faithful to the original 4-track masters of each film, and they add in mono mix elements of the first two films. So it's really like getting a sort of best of situation with all three. Unfortunately, after this point, for the successive second, third, and fourth special editions, they have gone back and remixed these tracks over and over and over again. And also, they usually put them in outdated codecs, like even had them in 5.1EX and 6.1 for a while. And then they add new effects, and they've ruined the dynamic range. And for a while, on the second special edition that was done for the 2004 DVD master and beyond, they had the surround channels flopped, on Star Wars at least, and had many errors in them. So unfortunately, after 1997, the films have sounded progressively worse and worse, and they just don't sound anywhere near what they originally were or what they were in 1997. Also, you no longer have the THX seal of approval. You no longer have the THX tap program. There is no longer a force or a company or anything trying to insist on theater quality control that is outside of the theater chains or the theater organizations themselves. Having that sort of third party meant that you could have someone to report to or ask questions, or there was some sort of in between. And that's why prints in the 1990s, especially at the end of the 1997 special editions, end with the tap card that says, if you experienced any problems in this theater, please phone us, 1-800-PHONE-THX or 1-800-THX. That's what that was about. Now you imagine going to a theater today and even trying to find somebody who's working when there's a problem, when the projector goes out, or you get nothing but a frozen glitchy mess, or the several of the channels are blown because you've got blown speakers, or they left the 3D lens on, or they've got the bulb turned down. I mean, the irony is that 40 years on, we have the exact same problems with theater quality control, and talking about major chain theaters, the majority of theaters across the United States. And we have even more problems now than what we did in 1983. And if that wasn't bad enough, the cost cutting has increased, and there are less people and less personnel, and most of the time, theater workers are locked out of certain areas. And if something goes wrong with the DCP, depending on the setup, there's not much you can do about it. And then also, if it's being done via a satellite connection, all they can do is start calling somebody who may be on the other side of the country or in another country, and then having to try to, do stuff over the phone. But then, there's no telling how that's going to work. And I've seen this stuff happen. But also, most theaters just don't care. And outside of your really premier film centers and your cinematheques and your handful of really wonderful art house repertory theaters that really try hard with their presentation quality, I mean, it pains me to say as a theater geek that I have to kind of be dragged kicking and screaming if people want to go see something, and I just know how much it's going to irk me that the quality presentation is so poor. And ironically, I mean, 40 years on, we're actually worse off than we were in 1983. And not only that, there's less support because there are less people, and actual employees are sort of being phased out of the equation in terms of the theatrical environment, and the focus is not on a quality presentation at all. And you can just run down the list of problems from improper masking to running all the pre-show features, which are mostly commercials, with terrible keystoned projectors, again leaving 3D lenses on, having bulbs turned down, having the sound turned down too low, having speakers blown out, never repairing them. I mean, it runs the gamut. So essentially, the last thing I would want to do is go and blow my hard earned money and drive to the one or two particular theaters in my area that, to make it even worse, were built, in the late 1990s, early 2000s as big premier theaters for two of the big chains, and they've been sort of run into the ground. So I can remember seeing phenomenal presentations there, particularly when it was still in the film era, and now that just rubs pours salt in the wound of just how bad things have gotten. But I'd have to drive way far out of my way and then drop $15 or $20 for the one or two show times of seeing a DCP of the fourth special edition of Return of the Jedi, and then have to see the fourth time the film has been changed, tweaked, and now with a just a terrible sounding version of the newest sound mix of the fourth special edition. And also remembering this is the 40th anniversary of the THX program, which no longer really exists. The company, the whole brand was purchased and is now only used sporadically, really as sort of a means of putting a stamp on some consumer products, and it was never really replaced by any sort of other theater quality control program. So I just started thinking about this again because, again, someone brought up the fact that they were doing this limited reissue of Jedi in just a handful of theaters, and it just got me thinking again. And I just started to get really frustrated and mad again that this really just, again, it sort of pours salt in the wound. Still no release or no word about the status of the original unaltered trilogy. Not even releasing it on the actual 40th anniversary of the film's release date, not supporting it, only doing it as a limited sort of one-off for a few days in a few select theaters that partner with Disney. In my area, it's being shown at one Regal location and one AMC location. And again, I know for a fact that if I went to either of those, even if I paid for their so-called premium halls, it's going to pale in comparison to the films I've seen there in the past and what I have fond memories of, because those were gigantic, fantastic flagship theater locations for both chains, originally Regal and Carmike when they were constructed. And I also remember seeing the 1997 special edition re-release as a kid. That was my first major Star Wars experience. It's still very important to me. And I remember, again, I was only 6 or 7 at the time, but I remember how impactful it was. And I remember how incredible the audio felt. And you can actually experience this at home. That's why I have the 97 Special Edition Laserdisc box here, which actually does contain the 97 5.1 mixes. This is the only way you can experience this at home in discrete quality. You do have to have an AC3 RF demodulator, but it is the 1997 theatrical 5.1 remixes for all 3 films. They are by far the most make a home theater geek grin like an idiot and have a blast and make your neighbors hate you versions of the Star Wars trilogy. So if you've ever wanted a more impactful, discrete mix of the Star Wars trilogy, this is what you have to go to. It also has the surround matrix version as PCM if you don't have a demodulator. Now, this also did turn up on the VHS release, so if you don't have a Laserdisc player and you still happen to have a version of the 1997 special edition on VHS sitting around, and you happen to have a VCR with hi-fi stereo, if you plug that into your receiver and put it on, hopefully you have the letterbox tapes. But if you put that on and you matrix it out to, 4-channel decoded left, center, right mono surround, and you're able to run it in your home theater environment, it's definitely going to give you a kick in the pants and blow your socks off and make you just wonder how in the heck this mixed down to VHS in 1997 can still sound better than both the Blu-ray and the new UHD presentations, and of course also the 2004 DVDs as well. So again, it just really stuck in my craw, and just I started thinking about it, and the more I thought about it, the madder I got, and then the more I realized this was just as important for THX and how badly theater quality has just gone and nosedived, and to such a degree that, I've seen it in my lifetime. I've seen it happen. It wasn't just a digital changeover. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And, if people want to discuss why are theaters dying and why are so many people not going to theaters as much, well, when you can spend a decent amount of money, but not a crazy amount of money, and already go out and get at least even a mid-level 4K television for anywhere between $400 to maybe $800. You don't have to break the bank, and then you buy a decent receiver for a couple $100, and then you start putting together at least some sort of home theater setup. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, but when you put a decent amount of time, research, and a little bit of money into something, and have it, you can then have a more consistent experience in terms of quality presentation in your own home than you can your local theater. I think that has something to do with it, or at least it does for me, because I think it's absolutely ridiculous that that's what we're seeing now, and I think that's a gigantic problem. And if people are going to talk about the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi, we need to discuss the fact that the original trilogy in its original theatrical release form has still not been reissued to the public and not been properly restored, and there is no seemingly legal reason why Disney cannot do this. It's simply because they apparently don't want to. I guess they don't like money, because I don't know anything else in the world that would sell out faster than people hearing that the original unaltered Star Wars trilogy was finally being not only restored, but shown to the public and then released. I don't know what else would get high sales numbers. If they're not willing to do that, then, what's the point of anything else? But also, it's important to discuss the fact that we're now looking at the 40th anniversary of the THX program, and now nothing like that exists, and theater quality has nosedived to, I think, a lower point than it was even in the early 1980s, when Lucasfilm became so invested in trying to combat this problem that they even developed these new standards and the THX certification, and then eventually the theater alignment program. So again, this is just more of my open-ended thoughts, but I just felt I had to say something because it just really bugs me the more I think about it. I sort of part and parcel with the way that Disney treats Star Wars, and they think that they can simply just throw things out there and all the fans will support it simply because it's been stamped Star Wars. This would have been the perfect opportunity to do something different for a change, and actually show that you care about the films, because they clearly don't. Again, this is just my opinion, but I started spitballing and thinking, and I just started going off on this tangent, and then when I realized, hey, wait, it's the anniversary of THX as well, and that ties into, how badly I feel about theater quality presentation in 2023 and everything else. It just snowballed from there. So that's why I felt the need to say something in video form, and why I thought it was important. I would love to continue the conversation in the comments below. If you've had some similar feelings or had some similar terrible experiences in modern theaters in terms of the quality of presentation and the feeling that quality control is just no longer existing in any form. And also your thoughts on the various special editions of the Star Wars trilogy. And now we're expected to just enjoy the fourth special edition of the trilogy with additional changes once again. And the fact that Disney doesn't seem interested in preserving the original unaltered trilogy, and for seemingly no reason, because there's nothing stopping them. As far as we know, there's no contract. And when they purchased Lucasfilm, it didn't say somewhere you can't release and restore the original trilogy. Although I wouldn't put it past certain people, apparently, considering past actions and things. So it just sort of boggles the mind, and it just feels like a complete missed opportunity. And again, it gets me all frustrated and hot and bothered again. But I just thought it was important to make the point about THX also being 40 years old, and with theater quality being in the toilet in 2023, the last thing I think anybody wants to do is go and drop $20 and go to a random theater out of their way and see a DCP of the latest crappy special edition re-edit, redo of Return of the Jedi. And it's not even on its actual 40th anniversary. It's like that's the cherry on top of the crap sundae. That it's not even May 25th, which is the actual anniversary of the release date and the true Star Wars day. If you go all the way back to May 25th, 1977. So again, this is a very nerdy video. It's I admit most people are probably not going to know what I'm talking about or even think any of this is important, but I think it's important, and I just started thinking about it more, and I thought it would be good to expound upon in video form. And maybe someday we can see the return of the THX Deep Note in theaters, and at least know that someone somewhere cares about quality control, whether it's THX or someone else. It would be really something to see and experience outside of when you run, say, an old Laserdisc and get the Laserdisc version of the THX logo, and remember a time when you could go to a theater and know that when you purchased a ticket, and you got the THX Deep Note once you went in, that at least somebody somewhere cared to try and present a film correctly and accurately and with some degree of showmanship, of actual, caring about the presentation to then make the audience feel good, like they haven't just thrown their money away and they could have just waited a couple months and seen it at home instead. So I'm off to go jam out to some classic low-down grooves of Lapti Knack, because I'm not feeling Jedi Rocks today. And, I'd like to see Sebastian Shaw every once in a while instead of Hayden Christensen. Unlike some people, I like seeing the effects shots as they were originally done, composited and photographed, and not tweaked and redone to infinity. I also like a soundtrack that doesn't sound like crap. So for the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi, I will be, as I always do, watching the film on one of my Laserdisc editions. And I encourage everyone out there to do the same, or with whatever best version you can get your hands on or you may have in your collection, and celebrate the 40th anniversary of the film in your own way. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.